So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the panel, What Future for the Rule of Law in Central America? A conversation with a special envoy for the Northern Triangle, Ricardo Zuniga. This event is organized by the Washington for Law Society. I'm Juliana Canet, the president of the Washington for Law Society, founded in 1952 to promote knowledge and understanding of international legal matter, comparative legal issues, and foreign law. Given the number of participants, tonight you will be muted, but able to communicate with us via the Q&A channel. Please send the question for our distinguished panelists via the Q&A, and we'll get to those toward the end of the event. This session will be recorded. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter and LinkedIn, and please come our annual meeting, join the society, and come next week on October 21st for the Washington Foreign Law Society annual meeting. I will put the link of the annual meeting in the chat. Our special guest today is Mr. Ricardo Zuniga. He is the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary and Special Envoy for the Northern Triangle. He has a career in Foreign Service, is a member of the Senior Foreign Service, and he previously served in various capacities in various countries, among those Brazil, Mexico, Portugal, Cuba, and Spain. You can read his full biography in our invitation to this event. Mr. Zuniga will be interviewed today by Mr. Alberto Mora. Mr. Mora is the American Bar Association's Associate Executive Director for Global Programs. In his capacity, he directs the ABA Global Rule of Law Initiative, oversees the ABA Human Rights Center, and coordinates the ABA relationship with the United Nations and specialized agency and function. Welcome to both. And Mr. Mora, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Juliana. A pleasure to be here, and thank you for the invitation. And it's a pleasure to be here with Ricardo and have a conversation about some important issues in Central America. Ricardo, you've had a very distinguished and substantial career in the Foreign Service. Let me start on a lighter note before we get to the more serious topics. Is this the toughest job you've had in the Foreign Service?
Yes. No question. No question. This is the toughest job. Look, this is. I mean, we're really dealing with structural issues in the Americas. We're getting at the heart of some of the most challenging constraints to civil liberty and to kind of individual freedom that we have seen in the Americas that stem from structural problems that go back 500 years. And the tools that we have for dealing with these problems are just very limited. And I think we try to approach these with a sense of humility, a sense of understanding that we are trying to understand why it is that we are doing what we're doing, who it is that we're trying to help. These when I think about the work that we're doing in Central America, this is one of the most connected parts of the world to the United States. We have last night I was with a group of Salvadoran immigrants. It was 50-some people from around just the DC area who have been incredibly successful and are very worried about the direction of events in their country. I could repeat that for almost every country in Central America. And we have tried to use foreign assistance. We've tried to use diplomacy, all to unlock a potential that we know exists in Central America. But on issues of governance, unfortunately, we've seen events trend in the wrong direction. And in many ways, it's because the structural issues that I discussed work for somebody, and the people for whom they work are very reluctant to relinquish the power that they have, and they, within their spheres, are enormously powerful and able to counteract really democratic actors and people who are trying to work on behalf of their citizens and who are promoting reforms. So it's a tough area, and I think that if people think of the United States as a very powerful country, and it is, as a country that wields enormous political influence, which we do, and as the largest economic actor in the region, which we are. But that doesn't mean that in a situation in Nicaragua or in Guatemala or El Salvador, that when you have a motivated, in some cases criminally inclined or authoritarian-leaning actor, that they can't capture the state in some way and really undermine the well-being of their own citizens as well as the relationship. These are hard things, but they're also hard things that matter to a lot of people, a lot of Americans, a lot of dual nationals, and a lot of people in the region who we are very close to. And so it is the hardest thing I've done. It's also, I think, the most important thing I've done. So I'm very proud of the work that we've done with the team.
You touched on some of the issues already, but 2 months out, sponsoring here, what is the state of democracy and the rule of law in the region, and what are the trends there?
So I would say democracy is under intense strain in Central America. Rule of law is perhaps even under more intense strain. The challenge in Central America is really something that we're seeing really around the world, definitely in the Americas, where there's a belief that really publics have lost confidence in political classes and in politics to solve the problems that they face. And we could say that about many societies in the Western world, and it's absolutely the case in Central America right now, that the problems, and by that I mean insecurity, lack of opportunity, deep inequality, in many cases exclusion from the formal economy. In some countries, 70% of the workforce is in the informal economy. So in all of these areas, government has not been viewed as a sustainable solution. In many cases, it's because of the attention drawn and because of the corruption, but also the attention drawn to that corruption. And even more than that, weak governance. I would say that there is a belief that government is unfortunately viewed as part of the problem rather than part of the answer. And politics, not just government, but politics are viewed as part of the problem and not the answer. And when you have people who lose hope in that way, the appeal of authoritarian solutions rises, even though, and I think here it's very important to underline, where we see the greatest failures are in the most authoritarian countries in the region, where you see the collapse of economies and societies, as in Venezuela, really as in Nicaragua, where we saw an abysmal response to the pandemic, for instance, and really a rejection of it in a situation that has killed thousands of people. The challenge is clearing space and supporting those many people who are trying to do the right things and trying to use democracy to accomplish, to serve the public good. There are many of those people. In fact, I would say the majority of people, including many people who are in the civil society, in the private sector, and in government in some way, do want the right things. But unfortunately, the events over the last 10 years have skewed in favor of those who want to preserve a status quo that's fairly unequal.
You've talked about the relationship of rule of law with democracy, and you mentioned that the rule of law is in even worse shape than democracy is. At least the recent trends seem to indicate that. Could you amplify that? What do you mean by that?
Yes, certainly. So if the notion that independent court systems are supposed to counterbalance executive and legislative power is one of the essential elements of democracy. It varies by country, certainly. Every country has its traditions and its rules. There are also in every country in Central America long traditions of highly effective jurists and people who are very committed. In fact, really some world-class jurists in some cases. But unfortunately, executive power has grown significantly, really, in relation to the other branches for the most part. And both the legislatures and the executive branches have captured the judiciary certainly in Nicaragua, which is a full-on single-party authoritarian state now. It is a dictatorship. There's no real question about where it falls in the spectrum. Whereas in El Salvador and in Guatemala, our concerns have to do with judiciaries that have been independent but under strain, and attorneys general that have been at different points independent but under pressure. that have now really come under intense control, much greater control, and in many cases, unfortunately, have been acting in favor of corrupt actors. And what we're seeing is that we have many examples that in Honduras there was in the early 2010s there was pressure on the Supreme Court there to essentially make a ruling that permitted a re-election of a president who was able to be re-elected, but that called into question the independence of that judiciary and whether it was under political pressure. We've seen that really in a much larger and more distressing degree in El Salvador, where Supreme Court magistrates, where basically the entire constitutional court was removed under really irregular and, according to Salvadoran jurists, unconstitutional measures to put in place people who were seen as highly favorable to the executive, really people who were there at the service of the executive. In the case of Guatemala, there is an attorney general in whom we've lost confidence because she worked to undermine the independence and activities of an anti-impunity, anti-corruption prosecutor team that had yielded important gains in the fight to gain greater transparency and to fight impunity and corruption in Guatemala. So in these cases, what we see is that unfortunately, we've seen a retreat in the power of the judiciary to exercise its function, its core function in a democratic state.
We've seen this too at the American Bar Association, and I think you're referring in part in Guatemala's case to Consuelo Porras' firing of Juan Francisco Sandoval, the respected prosecutor on anti-corruption matters. You've placed, or the State Department, more accurately stated, has placed the names of certain actors in which we have lost confidence in the governments in that area. What do we hope to accomplish with that list and that kind of naming?
So these are congressionally mandated. So we're instructed by the Congress to do these. We also happen to believe that it's important for the United States to be very clear about what we're seeing with regard to rule of law and governance and transparency and corruption, particularly where it involves public officials and officials in public life. And as in the case of the Attorney General of Guatemala, a person with whom our law enforcement agencies have worked to some extent quite productively. Guatemala has a record number of extraditions, and over the last year has been very helpful in terms of drug interdictions. At the same time, we've tried to avoid what we've seen as a pattern, perhaps in the part of the United States in the past, to overlook questionable behavior by public officials because the balance was, well, we're getting something out of this relationship on the one hand. What do we do if we publicize the concerns that we have? That's a very natural diplomatic response and it's the correct one. You have to balance your interest and determine what you can get and how you can accomplish what you can accomplish out of a relationship. The difference right now in Central America is that, number one, the scale and scope of corrupt activity is greater than it was even 10 years ago. And so the corrosive effect that it has on society is greater than it was 10 years ago. We have prioritized governance, and actually it's a national priority, not just in Central America, it's an international priority for this administration to target corruption as one of the main forces undermining democracy and rule of law and really economic success. And that's very much the case in Central America. It's really emblematic of what we're seeing in some cases globally, but it's very real. What we hear from US companies that want to invest in Central America is their number one concern is rule of law, lack of judicial certainty, and corruption. And so our job, we see it as removing barriers to growth in Central America. This is not something, the situation in Central America cannot be resolved through just US foreign assistance. It's important, but it's not nearly the most important factor. The most important factor is, are we able to help create the enabling conditions for domestic growth, sustainable growth, within each of these countries. And that requires attention to rule of law. And that also, attention to rule of law, requires being very clear about where we see corrupt activity by people who are in public life.
Ricardo, Secretary Blinken has indicated that fighting corruption is now a core national foreign policy priority. Does this indicate an elevation of the fight against corruption within the hierarchy of national security objectives?
Yes, absolutely. And it is connected to, number one, what we see as the fact that democracy is under threat really around the world. Corruption is a core part of why that is. Number one, as I mentioned earlier, it undermines public confidence in the role of political actors and in government itself. But number two, what we see now in hybrid states around the world is that corruption is an end in itself, but it's also a vital tool for those who are seeking to impose an authoritarian state. Corruption is how you pay your supporters. Corruption is how you finance outside of the state budget. And in many cases, just the case of Nicaragua is very emblematic. It's also a reason why people maintain why they tighten their control over their countries, is for the purpose of exercising corrupt activity.
Speaking about Nicaragua, it seems that the news almost every week or every other week brings information about Daniel Ortega arresting another opponent in the presidential elections. How do you see the democratic situation there and the election situation there? And what is Daniel Ortega doing?
Well, Daniel Ortega and his spouse, his vice president, and their family members are trying to snuff out democracy in Nicaragua, really eliminate not just the forms of democracy, but democratic culture. So what they are doing is engaging in effectively a reign of terror to intimidate not only their political opponents in a way to try to, essentially shut down the election to any opposition at all, but also even people who might be on the fence and people who might be their erstwhile supporters. They want them terrified because their main objective here is not just to undermine democracy, but it's to impose the rule of their family for an extended period, which sets Nicaragua apart from even other authoritarian-leaning states in the region, where there's some other sort of realm, other sets of actors. In Nicaragua, it's a family business, and unfortunately, we are quite concerned because what they have done is, through laws that they've passed over the last year, 6 laws in particular that were aimed at using the judicial system to dismantle the democratic culture. That's something that we fear could be repeated and borrowed from and copied by other states that might not be as extreme and open in what it is that they're doing. So, for example, in laws that are meant to cut off international support for NGOs, in laws that are meant to give the state and the ruling, the leadership, the ability to effectively select their political opposition. These are laws borrowed directly from Russia and with Russian advice. And unfortunately, they are attractive to those who want to maintain some sort of trapping of democratic form while undermining the fact of democracy, the reality of democracy, and how it's experienced by most people. As I said, in the case of Nicaragua, even people who may have been inclined to support Daniel Ortega, they would prefer to rule by fear and intimidation than by support. And I think that they did this because they most likely did some polling that demonstrated they had no chance of winning a fair election.
What are the tools that the United States has to attempt to counteract this and to strengthen civil society in their effort to regain democratic control over their country?
So probably the most important tool is not a U.S. government tool, but the fact that civil society while weak and under pressure in Central America, is vibrant, is real, including in Nicaragua, and has a strong international network of support. So I know that the ABA has been extremely important in helping those who have been trying to use court systems to press for transparency, for instance, just to take an example. But there are many instances of that fall outside the U.S. government, but where we're very happy to help. Then we have quasi-U.S. government organizations or ones that have strong U.S. backing, like the National Endowment for Democracy, which has been crucial to preserving independent media, which we haven't even discussed here, but which is one of the institutions that is under the most intense pressure. As I said, the National Endowment for Democracy, IRI, International Republican Institute, National Democratic Institute, and then a host of other entities, not all U.S. entities, but entities with which we partner from Europe, from the Americas. These are all crucial actors in providing some kind of outlet, support, backing, oxygen, really, to the democratic actors in situations where they're under intense pressure. We do have sanctions have their place. They are important in terms of ensuring that U.S. government resources and U.S. resources are not contributing to the imposition of an authoritarian state or to criminal activity or to corruption. But all they can do is limit the power they can't remove and are not intended to remove from power. Sanctions are intended to shape the actions of the target of those sanctions or to shape the environment in which those actors operate. And we must be very realistic about the fact that the people who are potentially the targets of those sanctions have found ways to either overcome them or to really survive with those. We do have, because of Congress and because of other authorities, we do have the ability to use, for example, visa restrictions that do matter in Central America. They might not matter as much in another part of the world. In Central America, as I said, the connections are so deep that it does matter. And we're not targeting so much the most negative actors, but those who would be tempted to support them, people who have something to lose. Daniel Ortega and his wife have very little to lose at this point. They have made their decision that they are going to impose an authoritarian state. But there are actors in Nicaragua who don't want to be associated with that. And so, in a sense, the visa restrictions and so forth are really meant as a deterrent to ensure that people who might be on the edge would lean against association or aid to the kind of the imposition of this authoritarian leadership. And I think we have to say that the most important thing that we have is not, again, a U.S. tool, but anything that we can do to aid pro-reform, civil society actors, people in the private sector, and people in the public sector that are aiming to do the right thing in their country is probably the most important thing we can do. That's using policy and diplomacy. So it's really our visibility that probably matters most of all. And what we say does still matter significantly in the Americas.
As you kind of adverted, there are heroes in every country, acting individually or in civil society groups that are fighting to maintain democracy, fighting for the rule of law, and do so often under incredible risk, physical risk as well as economic risk and reputational risk. We at the ABA were very deeply involved in attempting to maintain CICIG's involvement in Guatemala. And when CICIG was kicked out of the country, we were dismayed to see that these malign forces that engineered the removal of CICIG continued to persecute those who were engaged, who were employed with CICIG or who supported CICIG. And we were dismayed by the difficulty in protecting those kinds of individuals from that kind of assault. How can we more effectively protect those individuals who are fighting for democracy in the region?
So I think you're absolutely right that some of the people who worked most actively to preserve rule of law and to work against impunity have been the victims of the very corrupt actors that they sought to uncover and identify and hold to account. I think it's extremely important, first of all, to continue to talk about the importance of that work that they were doing, that these individuals were doing, and there have been some discussions of finding ways to ensure that people have an escape hatch, by some sort of ability to leave and to continue their work from abroad, if that's what's necessary. Some foundations have considered providing that kind of support. We think that's important. I think that continuing to discuss and maintain very much in the public eye and in the eye of not just in the United States, but in other parts of the world, why it matters, why that work matters, I think is really crucial. Maintaining raising the profile of the risk and the threat that exists, I think is extremely important. Being creative about using other international tools to help these actors continue their work in some way, I think is extremely important as well. I think that one characteristic of these actors is that they remain very involved. I just take Claudia Paz y Paz, for instance, as somebody who has maintained a very active international juridical role. Others can do the same as well. I think that we are, we continue to look for ways to elevate the work, and again, the conditions under which they're operating. Most importantly, is continuing to talk about what is actually happening on the ground and why it matters to the international community.
Earlier in your opening comments, you referred to the role of economic elites, some economic elites in the region in terms of either actively helping or contributing to the corruption, or at best being neutral or indifferent and not acting to help improve situations in the country. How can these elites be convinced to actually play a more constructive role in helping restore democracy in their countries?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that? I just missed the.
Oh, so sorry. I was referring to your earlier comment in your opening remarks about economic elites in these countries sometimes being contributors to the corruption and the misgovernance of the countries. How can those elites be convinced to act differently?
Well, I think that's really an important point. And I think the United States also recognizes that there are very powerful actors who are going to be very powerful actors for a long time in Central America. And that this is not, we don't want to say that we're looking at a monolith. In fact, there are many private sector actors who have supported transparency initiatives and who are themselves interested in seeing a more level and open playing field. And so we want to be very careful that there are people who are involved in corruption who are in government, certainly in the economic sector, and organized crime. And that's one group of people. You have a very large group of people who, on the one hand, operate within the system that exists. When you have conversations with people who would rather be, they are, for example, those particularly the Central American multinationals. They have to be very careful about their own reputational risk and being in compliance to the extent that they can. So it's not a situation where we want to cast everyone as being involved in corruption. That's not the case. In fact, the private sector, and there are many actors that have been victims of corruption, and we've seen this time and again, both internationally and domestically. And so we want to help them, and we know that there are many people in the private sector who would far prefer to have greater transparency. So we work with them to we want to show that we have an affirmative agenda, and we do. We have a very dedicated effort to try to promote economic growth in Central America by removing barriers to that growth. Part of that involves gaining greater transparency over issues like export and import procedures, helping streamline and clarify tax procedures and administrative decisions by governments, assisting the parts of the regulatory system to become digitized or to have greater public access, so that companies are not subject, as they are, for example, in some cases in El Salvador, to allegations of tax fraud that are being driven by political considerations, and the same thing has happened in Guatemala and Honduras, where tax law, where the administration is used for corrupt purposes. The private sector would like to have protection from that kind of overreach and misuse. So we can join in partnerships in that front. I think that where we see greater challenges are on some of these long-standing issues, very often around the extractive industry, for instance, or the agricultural industry, where there are local actors, where there's an intense issue over land tenure or disputes over conflict between indigenous and communities and developers, the kinds of things that really should be resolved through political protections and through the political process, but where too often the weaker actors are not protected by the law, and more powerful actors are protected by the authorities. So there's understandably a skepticism among people in some civil society actors who view most of the private sector with suspicion, and then some private sector actors who view civil society as an adversary instead of an ally. Trying to break those down and keep people operating in a similar direction in favor of transparency, with and in support of a broad-based economic growth that's going to benefit everyone. I think that's one of the greatest challenges we have, but also an area where we probably have the most likelihood of achieving sustainable success.
So, having been formerly a corporate general counsel, there's no question that an increase in corruption, as we're seeing in Central America, worsens the economic climate and increases investment risk for any foreign investor thinking about investing in the region. Is there a role for the American corporate sector in addressing some of these problems in Central America?
There's an absolutely important, crucial role for the U.S. private sector in doing this. And let me list a few of the ways. First is that a large number of important economic actors in Central America want to be associated with major U.S. economic actors. And of course, U.S. economic actors are bound by FCPA, among other oversight mechanisms. FCPA, I've seen this in other settings. It at one level used to be seen as something of a competitive disadvantage. Now it's a competitive advantage because it confers reliance. It basically increases the brand appeal of and the reputational risk profile of an actor that aligns with a U.S. company. So what U.S. companies bring is greater governance. They also bring, for instance, in the case of a company that does agricultural work or that's involved in buying locally, those supply chains also must be in compliance, because a U.S. company has to be in compliance with U.S. as well as local law. And so often on issues related to labor, forced labor, child labor, health, and phytosanitary standards, many small producers are brought into a formal supply chain through association with U.S. companies when they would never have that access through any other means. And so we believe that the that in terms of corporate governance, in terms of true attention to reputational risk and compliance, the U.S. private sector brings enormous value to Central America. Also, again, in casting the affirmative message, the U.S. private sector also has the power and the strength to say, we are prepared to make the following investments if the conditions permit. And it's those conditions where the United States government and other diplomatic actors and the private sector can work together to work with local governments, with governments in the region, to help improve that environment, the governance environment, so that we can see ultimately the most important thing of all, which is that the creation of opportunity in Central America. And it's that creation of opportunity, formalization in the economy, social mobility, corporate social responsibility in the true sense that goes beyond just into the community itself. These add enormous value, and they also add reassurance to other economic actors that the environment is appropriate and potentially good for them to invest.
I'm not sure that these autocratic leaders, or increasingly autocratic leaders in Central America, are aware of the risk that their economies are running by the increasing levels of corruption and the continued erosion of the rule of law. Do you think they're aware of this? They make the connection between some of their autocratic actions and the peril they put foreign investment in?
So the concern I have is that they may not care. It's really important for us to reach out to as broad a network of actors as possible, because I believe the leaders themselves, number one, you're right, in many cases they have no idea that they are at what they're losing by opting to, for example, limit the role of civil society, or to undermine the role of independent media, or in the case of El Salvador, to really attack both the private sector and any opposition, any critical voices. But we see that repeated in other situations as well, and not just in El Salvador. And I don't think that they fully grasp, because the short-term advantages of limiting opposition and gaining access to resources tend to overwhelm or tend to outweigh other considerations, whereas other actors in those countries all have that's who you need to convince and continue to work with to demonstrate that there is something more to be gained by some other, by opting for a more open system, greater accountability, greater rule of law. And so that means some people in the public sector, some people, certainly civil society, and certainly in the private sector.
Ricardo, we haven't talked much about migration and the linkage between democratic erosion and the erosion also of the rule of law in those countries. But there's a clear link, isn't there, between the migration flows we see towards the United States and then the erosion of democratic democracy in the region. What's your thought about that?
These are directly connected, and in fact, our focus on governance is really twofold. The first is because for a while there was a belief, which there was a great deal of skepticism about, but some were making the case, in the case of Nicaragua, that while over the last 15 years, Ortega was behaving in a more and more autocratic fashion, he was providing economic stability, and so companies could operate, people could have jobs. Well, we see where it inevitably ended. It ended in a situation where we're, just in the last few months, 40,000 Nicaraguans have headed to the United States. There's 500,000 in Costa Rica, that many of them fleeing the conditions created by this authoritarian state. And so we have a very clear example, but I don't want to stop there, because the reality is that weak governance and corruption have directly contributed to this continuous and growing flow of irregular migration from Central America, because these actions basically eliminate opportunity for people to build their lives in Central America. And the only option becomes to leave, to go to Mexico, to go to the United States, or to go to Spain or another part of the world. Of course, that's not unique to Central America, but the level of migration, the level of departure is extraordinarily high because of the connection of Central America to the United States. So for us, this is a special and particular problem. So let's just take the case of El Salvador, where there is it's not quite accurate. Actually, it's not accurate, but some have said, and the Salvadoran government has suggested that migration from El Salvador has dropped because people are confident in the president of El Salvador. People are very confident. Salvadoran nationals are extremely confident in their president. They're very supportive of him. They may not understand that certain economic actions and decisions and governance decisions are actually putting the Salvadoran economy at grave risk. Our concern is that, and I'll just give a very concrete example. El Salvador was pursuing a $1.3 billion support program from the IMF because it was nearing really 100% of debt to GDP ratio in a very brief, after a very brief period, or within a very brief period, and was running out of financing options, and yet would not sign on to what we thought were very basic governance requirements established by the IMF. And what that tells us is that not only is governance not a priority, but that they're willing to forego economic stability in favor of political control. And that creates enormous concern in the United States, because not only is democracy at risk, but so is economic stability. And so who pays for that? Well, Salvadoran nationals, but inevitably Mexico and the United States, because people leave when conditions get bad. And migration has actually continued at a steady state from El Salvador, but it could get much worse if they don't bring some kind of macroeconomic discipline to and halt these, kind of a spending spree on programs that are intended to boost support for the leadership and not to actually create the conditions for economic growth. So and the question I ask with Salvadorans is, in a more democratic El Salvador, would we have had the decision to have Bitcoin be such an important part of the Salvadoran economy? Something that was viewed with intense skepticism by most Salvadoran citizens, and which has predictably not been particularly successful, and has further undermined the confidence of the international financial institutions in El Salvador's commitment to fiscal stability. These are, and the thing is that, of course, these are not sort of just notional. These have real life implications. And so that's a major concern for us. And you can repeat that across, there have been similar examples in other cases. But in any case, I would say that people are very frustrated, but they don't always fully understand, citizens in Central America don't always fully understand what is happening that is generating the lack of growth and lack of opportunity, whereas we have a pretty good sense of it. And our concern is that there's complacency on the part of certain actors in Central America, because they don't see that as a problem to have the export of migrants to the United States. They see that as a way to relieve pressure internally and to receive remittances in turn. And that's not a solution, nor is that something that is without high cost. Just to take the case of El Salvador, where you have something like 30% of children growing up without a parent because they are in the United States. And that's one of the major distortionary elements of this kind of massive irregular migration.
Ricardo, I think we covered a lot of ground, but we've only scratched the surface actually in some of these problems. But let me turn over back to Juliana for some questions from the audience as well. But let me thank you for your candor and the depth of the explanations that you've given us today. Juliana?
Thank you so much. Yeah, we have many questions from the audience, both live and sent before the event. I can combine couple in the following. How coordinated is the effort of the US within the government and also with other allies? You mentioned the certain kind of loan and financial help from the IMF or the IFIs. How coordinated is the effort of the US with the other allies, even in the financial tools that they can be granted or not granted?
So I think that there's a need to be very clear about this. On the governance front, in this administration, there's been an effort to ensure that there are governance conditions connected to loans to governments. For banks and financial institutions where the United States is a stakeholder, where we are either a shareholder or where we have we make another contribution, we ensure that that happens. There are other financial institutions that are not, where the United States is not an actor. And there we talk to and we liaise with and we try to use diplomacy to encourage strong rule of law conditions. It does not always happen. There are other considerations as well. And many financial institutions, their charter is not governance or anti-corruption, it's financial stability. And so the IDB has been a very good partner, particularly in recent months, in terms of ensuring that governance is part of the development vision for Central America. The IMF has done this, the decisions they made and the conditions they placed were the IMF's to make. They could go forward, for example, with this program in El Salvador without consulting the United States. It's the decision of the IMF. We appreciate that they listen to stakeholders in El Salvador as well as in the international community because they share our belief that that part of good governance is ensuring that lending is accompanied by very clear conditions related to transparency and, for example, the end user beneficiary. I can't remember the technical term, but please correct me. But the
recipient.
Yes, that's it. And revealing who that is and who benefits is key. And so, for example, insisting on clear procurement rules for governments, these are things that are increasingly part of the requirements established by financial institutions themselves. We strongly support that. We believe that's critical to the overall long-term sustainable success.
Thank you. Another question that was put on the table was which other kind of soft tool or diplomacy tool you can envision to help the situation beside the one you already mentioned, the network of NGOs. I don't know if we can qualify as a diplomatic tools, but what other stage or tools we can put in place or enhance?
I think very clear support for civil society on the part of not just governments, but actors in every ambit is really critical. We have to emphasize that sovereignty rests in societies and not in individuals, and that the fact that there are, again, many people who are working on behalf of the public good, private sector, civil society, public sector, those are people that should receive a voice and have an opportunity to speak. I think it is also important to be clear where there are shortcomings. We face criticism often for not doing enough to support democracy or democratic actors, or enough to punish authoritarian actors. That's part of what we need feedback. We need to understand when there's a perception or a belief or or when there's something else that we should be doing or could be doing. That's important for us to know. So I think being very clear with governments that do have influence in Central America is very important as well, and not just the United States, Spain, other countries in the Americas, Mexico, all should be part of this conversation.
Thank you. I will give the opportunity to Alberto for the last question. Please go ahead.
Alberto, what is a topic that we haven't covered that you think the audience should be aware of? Are there any issues that we haven't sufficiently addressed?
So there's one issue I think that's really increasingly important and in Central America, and that's the role of organized crime in politics, particularly at the municipal level. And we've seen this everywhere, really. In Nicaragua might be an exception, but that's only because there is a particularly interested family that is ensuring that they own the whole pie, or as much of it as they possibly can, are not willing to share it there. But everywhere else, in Guatemala and Honduras, to some extent in El Salvador, particularly associated with the narcotics trade, you see much more financing of mayoral candidates, for instance. There's very weak campaign finance oversight in Central America as a whole. And that is a major weakness, because what that means is that there are actors with whom you can negotiate, with whom you might have differences in the political sphere. But when you have this blending of political and criminal activity together, then you're moving in a direction that is extremely dangerous to not just democracy, but to rule of law in a fundamental way. And whereas we'd seen elements of it from time to time in Central America, now we're seeing this as something that has a much larger scope, much deeper reach, unfortunately, that could have long-standing consequences. So I think campaign finance, ironically, is an area that requires extremely close attention, that would merit extremely close attention. The other thing I would say is that a question was raised about what can be done to support. I would say the ABA does this. Others should do this as well. When there are actors that require some help trying to make a judicial case or to figure out how they can use their legal systems to protect democracy and rule of law, we should offer that assistance, and that the United States government can do some of that. But really, it's a range of actors such as ABA that are really critical players in all of this, because often are more agile, often have a clearer understanding of what can be done in the near term to support. We are more of a long-term actor and player. Our ability to use diplomacy means that that's good and important, but we can't provide the same level of direct support to, say, a prosecutor who is trying to that essentially needs protection from their own system. There are many things that we can do, but I think having good, supportive, close relationships with those actors is critical for those beyond governments as well.
Yeah, we would agree. We try to do that, by the way, on the CSIC matter. There were many critics of CSIC in the United States that we felt weren't really informed as to the real facts.
That's right.
We offered to sit down with them or their teams to review in detail, case by case, CSIC's record, and then rebut or attempt to rebut allegations of wrongdoing by the organization. But we, unfortunately, we weren't frequently taken up on our offer by many of the critics of CSIC.
Which is unfortunate, but we're going to see that repeated, because CSIC was dismantled and MAXI was dismantled in Honduras, and now CCS in El Salvador. That really has given the kind of the playbook for those who are defending themselves from accountability. And that is really unfortunate. And the only way to counter that is by keeping these successes and the work that was done and the methodology as successes, and saying that, in fact, they did what they were supposed to do. Perhaps it was incomplete. There were certainly problems, but they were doing what they were intended to do. And again, I think the other message that comes from that is, for me, the lesson that I've taken is there are people who have the skills and the ability and the political will to do the hard work of demanding accountability in Central America and pushing forward on transparency. Our role is to support those actors to the extent we can, and then help create the conditions where they might be able to operate more freely in the future as well.
Yeah. Juliana, back to you.
Thank you. Thank you. Clearly, your conversation has sparked many other questions. We cannot address all of them. I would like to thank you both speakers, and in particular, Mr. Zuniga, for his time and for opening our mind to this conversation on international politics, current affairs, international law. I don't know how to qualify. Thank you so much. And
Thank you so much.
Thank you to the attendees, and come next week. Bye. Thank you.
Really appreciate the opportunity. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.